Okay, ready to start? Okay, hello everyone. So we just started the webinar and people are coming in from the waiting room. I'm going to share. So Anne, are you seeing the screen with the webinar? All right, welcome everyone. So yeah, welcome to our webinar entitled Protecting Our Campuses, Addressing Staff and Sexual Misconduct at in Universities. So my name is Melissa Hamilton. So I'm going to introduce the presenters really briefly. I'll give you a little bit more about their background right before they talk, and then I'll go through some of the pleasantries for the event today. So in order of presentation, as I hand it over, we'll have Sundari Anitha, who's Chair of Sociological Studies at the University of Sheffield. Then we'll follow that with Anna Bull, who's a Senior Lecturer at the University of York. We are happy to have Adrija Day, who's an UKRI Future Leader Fellow at the University of Westminster, and then I will follow it up today. Welcome to everybody. We have a large group of participants. That's great. People interested in this subject matter. Again, some housekeeping items. Closed caption is enabled, but if you don't like closed captions, you can turn it on or off on your own Zoom machine on your computer. So if it's annoying you, you can turn it off. If you would like it, you can keep it on. We are recording this, as you know, and we hope to make available the video thereafter. So if you need to log off for whatever reason before ending, or for what you wish to listen to it again, it will be made available. We don't have the chat feature functioning on this one, but we do have Q&A. The Q&A will be initially, if you put in a question or just a comment, your presenters will be able to view it. They'll be able to respond to you, and they may make it publicly available to everyone. And whatever questions you have in terms of for the presentations is put them in the Q&A, and we will follow them up at the end of all the presentations, meaning that we won't do Q&A after each presentation. We want to run through all of them. But thank you all for coming today and being interested in this subject. Obviously, the people who are presenting to you today, we have significant interest in this subject as well. And I'm really happy to have this collection of presenters who have, as you'll see, extensive experience in the area of sexual misconduct in terms of universities, and then just gender-based violence generally. So I don't want to do, I'm going to hand it over so that we get to a lot of content to you today. And so our first speaker then today is Anitha. And as she is sharing, I will give you a little bit more of her biography. So Sundari Anitha is chair in sociological studies at the University of Sheffield. Her research interests lie in the problem of violence against women and girls, and gender, race, and ethnicity in employment relations. She's a member of the University and College Union's Task Force on Sexual Violence, which authored the very important report, Eradicating Sexual Violence in Tertiary Education. She was also part of a team that conducted the first ever research on the GBV policies of 129 UK universities. And she's been very active in policy making to tackle violence against women and girls for many decades. So now I will hand it over to Anitha. Thank you. Anitha, you're still on mute. Oops. And you need to reshare, and
yep.
Now we can hear you. Just reshare your slides.
There. So, yeah. Here I am, and what I am going to do today is talk a little bit from my trade union hat as member of the Sexual Violence Task Force, but I'll also briefly dip into some of the other research that Melissa mentioned on UK university policies on gender-based violence. So the report that I'm talking to was called Eradicating Sexual Violence in Tertiary Education. It represents the work of 13 union members who were convened in 2020 to examine sexual violence across the sector. And the aim was to understand prevalence among staff. And that's the focus of today's session on staff, not student on student sexual violence. And this included PGRs. So this almost coincided with the campaign by the trade union to a focus on recruiting postgraduate researchers, because the boundaries between staff and students are sometimes blurred, particularly where students, postgraduate researchers, are teaching on temporary contracts. And the aim was to understand the state of the problem, but also how those who complain are, what their experiences are, as well as to inform the union's own campaigning on this issue of its members. So the first key thing is the problem itself, how we conceptualize the problem. And here I must say the focus was on sexual violence, defined in particular ways. So it was used as an umbrella term to describe a whole range of sexual offenses. So Liz Kelly's concept of continuum informed our discussion, debate, and the framing of the problem. A whole range of rarer forms of sexual violence, such as rape and sexual assault, to more everyday forms, and in the offline and online worlds. So some of the examples are here, and that mirrors UUK's definition. And this broadening of the conceptualization of the problem is a positive step, because it's a counterpoint to certain perspectives which try and narrow that definition. And we did find that in the survey that we did, that I'll talk to, where some of the respondents found this problematic, and they wanted the focus to be on rape and serious sexual assault rather than the everyday forms. So that was one important point. The other is that the focus was on only sexual violence, and I was one of the few members who wanted to broaden the focus to gender-based violence more broadly, but this is something I'll come back to later. It is a feature of the Office for Students focus, UUK's focus on sexual violence or sexual misconduct, rather than more broadly gender-based violence. And I do find it a problem, because we know, for example, that domestic violence, when it comes to students, it's the highest prevalence is among young people in the age group that would be at a university. And also there is very little focus on domestic violence or other forms of gendered violence within staff communities. But this is where we were with this particular report. And survey, very briefly, I will list through the survey. So it was a survey of union members, that's important to know. But the responses were nearly 4,000 responses. And there was a whole other range of other groups of the quantitative survey didn't just cover union members, also covered the reps, union reps, and other professionals working in the area, lawyers, academics. And there was a qualitative follow-up with survivors and those who are working on this issue in the sector. So very briefly, what did it reveal about the state of the sector and what's happening here? So 10% of those who responded to the survey directly experienced sexual violence in the last 5 years. And over half, just over half, did not report it to their employer. And you can see why in the figure that you see in front of you. 49% experienced it from a colleague, manager 18%, line manager 10%. So 3/4, it's from a colleague or line manager. So it is a problem that's widely prevalent, and it's staff on staff, though there is a 14% student and a few unspecified, which could be visitors to the campus or guest lecturers. So what it also shows is, if you look at different forms, it maps it in terms of what was the prevalence of different forms. But what's important is that only 30% of those who said they'd experienced it experienced a one-off incident. For 70%, the majority, it was a pattern, ongoing series of incidents or a pattern of behavior. And that's really important to document, because Then, if we're counting individual incidents, what we're seeing is an undercount. So the way the crime survey, for example, would count it would be through incidents. And so the figure we have by that measure would be an undercount. What we found in the accounts, in the qualitative responses to surveys, as well as the survey questions, so there were some open-ended questions, as well as the follow-up interviews with survivors, was a sense of a hostile environment. I wish I could have reported him with any confidence that he would have received consequences for his actions. But he deliberately behaved in a way that would tell onlookers that we were close, we were not, and that this was just banter, it was harassment. He was known for his completely inappropriate behavior at work, both towards me, other colleagues, and students. His boss said it was just the way he was, without ever taking action. I wish we could have had some reliable protection from him that would have enabled reporting. And what we found in the qualitative responses again and again was this sense that it was very public. What was happening was not beyond behind closed doors. There was a knowledge of who these perpetrators were, and there was a pattern of behavior that was brushed aside, was just seen as this is how it is. And crucially, this particular groups were targeted. So where there's a pattern of behavior from the perpetrator, and we also talk about pattern of behavior in that it's hardly a one-off incident, not everyone was equally at risk. And this reaffirms what we know about gendered violence. It occurs at the intersection of inequalities. So those who were in non-permanent contract were more likely to report it than those who are in a permanent contract. If you look at the biggest differences, it's among those with disabilities and those without, and those whose sexual orientation they self-identified as non-heterosexual, those who again self-identified their gender identity as trans, non-binary, and other. So gender intersects with other inequalities to shape. And earlier there was data on the gendered prevalence as well. So gender is the key, and then it intersects with other inequalities. So how did staff experience disclosing and the complaints process? So as I said earlier, there was a sense of a culture or cultures of tolerance for sexual misconduct, and they reiterated what this did to their sense of what responses were available to them when they experienced it themselves. So I witnessed all of these behaviors at university events with the whole senior management team present and aware. When any of the women he was harassing said anything upwards, it was laughed off as him being a bit of a rogue, a bit of a joker. There was nothing funny about this man invading your space, touching your leg, sitting on the desk in front of you so his crotch was eye height and very close, thrusting his hips at you when you had to stand near him. Despite it being in plain sight, all of his behavior was disregarded, and he continued supervising postgraduate students. So, this is someone who was a student, postgraduate student, researcher, and then had a teaching role and experienced this, and nothing was done, and he continued having that relationship and behaving in that way with students. What it did was it created a sense of mistrust. I don't trust the investigating system, especially if the perpetrator is more senior than me. I didn't report it because I was worried about the consequences for me. And remember, 28% of victims experienced it from someone who was senior, a line manager or a manager. And those who were on temporary contracts were more likely to experience it. So all of that comes together in making it very difficult to report. I've got 5 minutes, wanted to be able to go to work confident that I wouldn't be harassed. When I told my land manager, though he believed me and offered emotional comfort, he made it clear how inconvenient it was that this had happened and that it would be better for the department if I didn't make a formal complaint. The pressure was on me to alter my behavior, to avoid my colleague, or simply put up with it. So, reporting rates were very low in a context where it was really discouraged. And despite this, when people reported, they had a very unsatisfactory experience. In many cases, no disciplinary action was taken. The institution, a department, was only concerned with covering up their star lecturer. Again and again, we had similar responses. Literally nothing happened, or nothing happened. I never heard back. And in this case, this person even had to share an office with him afterwards. He chose to move to a spare desk next to mine. And so this is something they hit a wall. The other thing that was really common was delays in processing the complaints. They ran out the clock, and I had to sit through it for 4 years before they would intervene, by which time the student was going to leave. So this was in the case when a postgraduate researcher who was on a teaching contract experienced derogatory comments from a student and wasn't supported. In another case, the union was also implicated in how they responded to this. The person took prolonged sick leave and left uni for another institution before the disciplinary hearing. And what this does is gives us a sense of impunity to perpetrators. He has a clean record. So this is a different person who's reporting on something similar that happened to them. Has a clean record and is now working at another HE institution with the same pattern of behavior. So what it does is it creates, there's no mechanism for safeguarding other women. So he's repeating this behavior and she's heard from the grapevine. So pretty much talks about how they were left on their own. And there's also the added, if they tried to share information to keep each other safe, whisper networks that have always worked in the absence of institutional mechanisms, they were afraid that he would go after them for defamation. And so the whole system seemed to be stacked against them. Another key thing that came out, and this is again, the data protection is used as a front, as a used quite inappropriately as a reason why those complainants aren't told about what's happening. If the perpetrator is going to be allowed onto the campus, then support needs to be provided to the reporting party. Someone said the information on the outcome, there's a bracket missing there, should be shared. If you went to the court, the victim would have all the details. It would be the same at work. So why don't we know what's happening is something, a refrain that came up again and again. So one of the key complaints of victims was this sense that the universities were putting themselves above this requirement to be transparent. So complainants did not know what was the outcome, and they did not feel safe in this context. So I think I have a couple of minutes. So what we get a sense of from that report is that sexual violence is pervasive within the tertiary education sector. And crucially, it occurs at the intersection of disadvantages. So not everyone is equally likely to be at risk. So we do need to think of how we frame the problem. We need to look beyond individual framing of the problem and frame it within the broader structural inequalities which it's rooted in and which it reflects. Institutional cultures, including within the trade union, create conducive contexts for this problem and prevent victim survivors from seeking and receiving redress, and create a sense of impunity for perpetrators. So this really needs to end now. And in many ways, the OFS requirements creates an imperative. And I suspect some of you are here in that context for change. But I have some thoughts on and some concerns on the way forward. First concern is that the focus is on a narrow part of the problem, and there's been an increasing focus on sexual violence, but it sits within a broader problem of gender-based violence, and we're not really thinking about that. So I think it's an opportunity that's missed. There's also a risk, I feel, that the focus will be only on students as the victims. So student on student, staff on student. Stop, my timer says. And a wide-ranging policy capturing staff and students is possible, and I think it's desirable. So I'm worried that might not happen, and it's an opportunity that's missed. I also worry that the problem will continue to be framed in an individualistic and gender-neutral way because the OFS guidelines and the UUK do it frame the problem in this way, and that doesn't reflect the reality of the problem, the experiences of victim survivors. And the focus on prevention on mandatory training is welcome, but I worry that there is not enough, because this framing of the problem is in an individualized way. I think there isn't enough dialogue on the theoretical underpinnings of the training, which is really important if a cultural shift, if challenge to the power inequalities which underpins these forms of violence is the aim of the training. So, in my other research, I've looked at university policies on gender-based violence. And some institutions in Scotland, particularly, have framed the problem more broadly, both in terms of gendered violence rather than just sexual violence, but also in terms of grounding it in an understanding of gender and other inequalities. And from that research, we've put together a checklist of do's and don'ts for university HR teams which are looking to do a health check of their policy. So it would be really good if there was a holistic approach to change rather than a narrow focus on ticking the OFS imperative now. I think I'll stop there. I'm just beyond my time. Stop sharing.
And you did wonderful. Thank you, Anitha. So if anyone has questions for Anitha or about the survey, go ahead and put it in the Q&A and we'll try to pick it up either answering in the Q&A or later. Our next presenter, Dr. Anna Bull, is a senior lecturer in education and social justice at the University of York. And what many of you probably know her is as co-director of the 1752 Group, a prominent research and campaigning organization working to address sexual misconduct in higher education, as well as multiple academic and public-facing publications on sexual misconduct in higher education, which I recommend, by the way. She's written quite salient articles. Anna sits on national advisory boards to address gender-based violence in higher education in the UK and Ireland, and co-authored the 1752 Group and McAllister Oliverius's Sector Guidance to address staff sexual misconduct in UK higher education. She's also carried out research into inequalities in classical music education and industry and sexual harassment in the film and television industry. The report called Safe to Speak Up, Sexual Harassment in UK Film and Television Industry Since Me Too. So Anna, happy to have you on board, and take it away, please.
Great. Thank you so much for organising, Melissa. It's great to be here. And I also appreciate, Anita, you setting the scene with that really important research from UCU. It was important to me as an activist in the space to see UCU stepping up and talking about these issues because, of course, UCU, as you mentioned, have got their own internal work to do, as well as shedding a light on this work in the sector. So I'm going to kind of build on what Anita has said and talk about where we're at now and how the new Worker Protection Act might make a difference to some of the issues that Anita was describing. And I should say that those issues have very much come up in my research around the kind of confusion, shall we say, around transparency and confidentiality, around serial perpetration or patterns of behaviour, and around the difficulties that survivors have in getting accountability. So I will just share my screen. Here we go. I was supposed to do that during the... There we go. Okay, hopefully you can see that. And thanks to those of you who've already put questions in the chat, which we will get onto as we go along. So as you may be aware, the Equality and Human Rights Commission published their new technical guidance on sexual harassment about 2 weeks ago, I think, very recently, 26th of October, less than that. And this also included the guidance on the new preventative duty on sexual harassment, which was passed recently. So it is now in force as of the 26th, which I think was last Saturday. We're a week and a half into this new regime, which is about preventing workplace sexual harassment. Now, this only applies to staff, not to students, unfortunately. Although for those of you in England, we will have the OFS guidance. So what does this mean? I think what's really helpful is that the new technical guidance, which covers the preventative duty, has some detail which really applies to how we're going to address some of the issues that Anita raised and that I've raised in my previous research. So I'm going to try and get through 4 of these today. This one you've probably heard me talk about before. Don't wait for a formal report to investigate. The second one is documenting informal disclosures and proactively using data. The third one is carrying out risk assessments into the environment, so preventative risk assessments. And the final one, again, one I talk about a lot, is avoiding passing the harasser. So, and then I'll give some general resources before I finish. So I've got a lot to get through in 15 minutes. Go. Okay, this is a direct quote from the Worker Protection Act guidance on the Equality and Human Rights website. I should mention that I responded to the consultation and along with other colleagues in the sector, and we were really pleased to see that our concerns and suggestions were taken on board by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So they've been quite responsive. So one of the things they said in this quite extensive guidance is where concerns about sexual harassment have been raised with an employer, it would be reasonable for the employer to take steps to investigate and ensure it does not happen again. This is music to my ears. And this is guidance towards addressing the pattern of behaviour. We know that staff in higher education who perpetrate sexual harassment, whether towards students or towards other staff, are likely to do this repeatedly. It's not likely to be a one-off. The evidence we have suggests that it's more likely to be repeated behaviour. So when one incident of sexual harassment is disclosed, the preventative duty kicks in. Because in order to prevent sexual harassment, when it's been disclosed once, you then need to make sure it doesn't happen again. And again, this is explicit in the guidance. So what does this mean? So again, this is just a very high level set of ideas, but I just want to talk about some of this conversation that's been happening within the sector around this issue. You might be familiar with Gemma White KC's report into Trinity Hall, Cambridge, which was in 2021. Now, she kind of was a precursor to this guidance. I just love it that she actually said this. She said, I have highlighted on a number of occasions throughout this report certain views that action cannot be taken in the absence of a formal complaint. This is wrong. Excellent. She said, current and future college leadership, so this was Trinity Hall that she was talking about, must embrace a more proactive approach to responding to concerns, however the information is received. And bearing in mind, she was talking about student, and also staff to student cases in this report. And she said, I emphasise that this issue is not specific to Trinity Hall and that many, if not all, higher education institutions have much work to do in this field. So I think what she's getting at here, the issue that came up that she was highlighting was that, and I'm sure you've come across this in your work, people come forward with concerns, and this is particularly common with staff to student cases, which is an area that I've focused on a lot. People come forward with concerns. They do not want to make a named report because they are scared of the perpetrator and they're scared of the consequences of making a named report. So for very, very good reasons, they don't want to put their name to and go through a formal process. So then the institution says, if you can't put your name to a formal report, there's nothing we can do. End of. Now, I'm really pleased to say that I think we are moving. I think in the sector, many of you may already have moved beyond this approach. What I'm aware of in many institutions is that wouldn't happen anymore. I think what's helpful about new emerging guidance is that it's stating this explicitly. And I think it's often the case that you might need to argue for this approach in your institutions. And actually make the case for making these changes. So, as I said, Gemma White's report was in 2021, but we at the 1752 group actually got there before her. In 2020, we published a briefing note on proactive investigations, where we advised where there was a risk to the wider staff and student population after a disclosure, then that universities could take proactive steps to investigate and gather data for investigation. And we're really pleased to see that the University of Cambridge has now got this in their policy. If you're looking to embed this in your institution and there isn't a framework for it, there isn't a structure for it, I would suggest looking at University of Cambridge's dignity and respect policy. I may have got that wrong. I think it's called Dignity at Work. My apologies. And they have a section called University Instigated Investigations. And this says, where a head of institution has become aware of multiple concerns or complaints of inappropriate behaviour in their area which may not have been formally reported but give rise to sufficient cause for concern, they may choose to conduct an investigation to understand the alleged behaviour in more detail and to determine if support and intervention are needed. If the findings indicate, this may lead to a disciplinary process under the relevant procedure. So that provides a route and policy for this to take action. And of course, there's a lot more to be said about this, but I'm just giving a whistle-stop tour. I do see we've got somebody with a hand up. We're not going to take verbal questions through the webinar. If possible, could you put that in a Q&A, because then my colleagues on the panel will be able to see that. But we're and that will be an easier way of dealing with your question. Okay, so the second point that comes up in the Equality and Human Rights Commission guidance is this kind of rather quaint phrase. They suggest employers should consider introducing an online or externally run telephone reporting system that allows workers to make complaints on either a named or anonymous basis. So you might be thinking, a telephone reporting system? I think the reason I put that in there is because Parliament has got an actual helpline where they document disclosures and signpost, but they also store names and information about disclosures. Of course, this could be an online reporting system, and so this could apply to, say, report and support if you have that in your institution. So I'm aware that in some institutions, report and support or other forms of anonymous or informal reporting, online reporting, are available for students and are not available for staff. If that's the case in your institution, this new guidance gives you what you need to take to your GDPR or to your legal experts in your institution and say, okay, this is fine. The Equality and Human Rights Commission has said we're able to do this. It doesn't give quite enough detail on the GDPR issues, but we'll signpost to some other guidance on that. So this is my second point. You should document informal disclosures where there isn't a formal report and proactively use this data. So there's an emphasis throughout this new preventative duty on, unsurprisingly, preventing sexual harassment and finding mechanisms in order to gauge what's going on in your institution, to gather data on that, and to try and move away from the main pathway being formal reporting. You've got to find out where there's risk of sexual harassment before it occurs. So documenting informal disclosures and using that data is a way to do this. And of course, anonymous reports also form very helpful data. So you should be reviewing this data at faculty and institution level periodically. Of course, in the early stages, there's not going to be a lot of data. So there's got to be some awareness raising of this. And of course, the Office for Students has said that all staff must have training in harassment and sexual misconduct. So as part of this, it would be possible to kind of raise awareness of these issues, and then identify departments or areas for proactive interventions. Right, so that's two. My third point is, this is one of my favourite bits, an employer is unlikely to be able to comply with the preventative duty for sexual harassment unless they carry out a risk assessment. I think this marks the biggest shift that we're seeing from this new preventative duty, the biggest shift in emphasis. Previously, we've had institutional mechanisms for handling sexual harassment that are all about complaints, having a complaints pathway or a grievance pathway for staff, and then a disciplinary process. And that's been the main institutional mechanism for handling sexual harassment. That's no longer the case. The EHRC are now saying pivot towards prevention. So when they say a risk assessment, that they're not talking about the kind of risk assessment that many of you will probably already be doing after receiving a disclosure, when you're trying to figure out if there's, what the risks are of, say, whether you need to suspend the alleged, the responding party, or what kind of precautionary measures you need to take. That's a different kind of risk assessment. This is a risk assessment into the working environment to identify high-risk areas for sexual harassment. So this is really moving towards a health and safety approach, which I think is a really positive step. Health and safety approach so at the moment, the Equality and Human Rights Commission regulates sexual harassment, and the Health and Safety Executive just leaves them to it and doesn't have anything to do with it. Realistically, the Health and Safety Executive should be involved because companies can be fined. And in fact, criminal charges can be brought for health and safety failings that relate to sexual violence. So if a worker gets sexually assaulted at work and that was preventable, that can be fined, and criminal charges can be brought under health and safety legislation. So I'm really glad to see that we're kind of starting to move a little bit towards this way. So thinking about the wider environment, and there's some helpful advice about the types of risks you might look for, such as the presence of alcohol, lone working or one-on-one working, power imbalances, which of course, if you're going to try and minimize power imbalances in higher education, that's a big job. But I'm really glad that it talks about that and we can start thinking about it. If you want some resources to help with this, I'd really recommend a code of practice from Safe Work Australia. And then there's a set of good practice indicators from Australia. As a New Zealander, it really pains me to say this, but the Australians are doing really great on this. The Respect at Work, which is the sexual harassment national body in Australia, have got this really helpful good practice indicators framework. Okay, and then the final point I wanted to talk about for a few resources to take home with you. This is something that I've been talking about for a long time. In my research, we found that the main outcome of reporting staff and faculty sexual harassment is that the responding party leaves the institution and moves to a different job. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission has made explicit that the duty to prevent sexual harassment extends to the risk that harassment may be repeated with a new employer in the future. So existing employers need to be aware of their duty not to provide a misleading or inaccurate reference to a potential employer. A misleading or inaccurate reference would be one that doesn't mention an ongoing or upheld disciplinary case. So there's some institutions, you may already have this covered. You may already be asking for HR or the last previous employer references, and you need to explicitly ask the question about ongoing or upheld cases. So a way to make sure you're doing this systematically is to join the misconduct disclosure scheme. So we launched a campaign in January this year to try and get universities to join the misconduct disclosure scheme. It's a commitment to ask two questions about upheld or ongoing disciplinary cases into sexual harassment of previous employers, and to provide that information to other hiring employers. The crucial thing for academia is it's international. So if we can get a critical mass of institutions internationally to join this, we can make a big dent in this problem of past perpetrator. So we've got a briefing note about it, which addresses the GDPR issues. And also this can help with compliance for the OFS, evidencing how your higher education institution is preventing abuses of power between staff and students. This could form one plank of your response there. So you can have a look online. So that's some of there's heaps and heaps more in the EHRC guidance. I'll just point you towards a couple of more resources which you may or may not know about before I close. So you may be aware that we've also been trying to get University and College Union local branches and national level to come on board with prohibiting staff to student sexual and romantic relationships. So on our website, we've got a frequently asked questions about this issue. So if you're introducing a policy in this area and you're having conversations with the unions, it might be a helpful resource for you guys as well, or if we've got any union members on board. You might find this helpful just to kind of think through some of the issues that might come up. We've got some suggested wording in there as well. We're currently offering evidence-based training and institutional change tools. We're focusing on postgraduate researchers because they are at heightened risk of staff and faculty sexual misconduct. So we're offering workshops for postgraduate researchers and supervisors, training for HR staff or those involved in handling cases, and there's a self-assessment tool for HEIs. And we use a case study-based approach. So we use real-life anonymised case studies with permission from the people involved, and that seems to work really well. Last bit, sorry, I really have to finish, don't I? I just wanted to flag up some good practice from UCL, which if you're looking at prevention, this could be a good way to do it as well. UCL added grooming to their policy on prevention of bullying, harassment, and sexual misconduct. So they use this definition of grooming, and that makes it easier to spot behaviours at an early stage and for people to raise concerns. So we think that that's a really, really helpful thing to do. And I know that the person behind this was Kelsey Pask, who's now available as a consultant. She's based in Australia, but is available for online consultancy for universities, and I really recommend her. Okay, I've spoken for too long, so I will wrap up there. But thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Anna. There was quite a lot of good information that you provided during that. And I also will highlight that the helpfulness of the 1752 group's website with lots of resources, as you indicated. So that's something that individuals can look at. So our next presenter, very happy to have her, Dr. Adrija Day, is a UKRI Future Leader Fellow at the University of Westminster. She was previously a British Academy Postdoc Research Fellow at the SOAS Department of Development Studies. Her research is titled Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Indian Universities, a study of campus life, student activism, and institutional responses. Her research is interdisciplinary in nature and draws from media, gender studies, politics, and development studies, specifically looking at feminist digital activism, activist media practices, cyber conflict and surveillance, social movements, intersectionality, and decolonizing methodologies. Thank you, Adrija, and take it away.
Thank you, Melissa. And thank you, Anna and Anitha. Like, you've set the background beautifully for everything that I have to say today. Can you see my screen? Anna, can you give me a quick thumbs up? Perfect. So as Melissa said, I am the PI of a project called FemIdeas. Please check out our new website. We're very proud of it. And we focus on developing survivor-centered, feminist, intersectional, decolonial, and abolitionist approaches to address sexual and gender-based violence in higher education. In this study, we draw from 4 case study locations, which is South Africa, Nigeria, Brazil, and Argentina. What I want to do in today's presentation is draw from my fieldwork in South Africa, and I'm going to talk about some of the practices to address staff sexual misconduct by gender officers in South African university, a model which few different South African universities use. And in that context, I'm going to talk about some good practices, but also some challenges and drawbacks if you want to implement a model like this, things for us to think about and be careful about. But before this, I really don't want to take a really romanticized view and say that it's all perfect there, because it is important to acknowledge that there is no standard response around sexual and gender-based violence in South African universities. In some universities, there are dedicated offices, and in some universities, there are not. And racial disparities manifest in the difference of resources and funding, and these dedicated offices are predominantly found in well-resourced and historically white universities, while historically Black universities continue to be under-resourced. But you may be wondering that why am I talking about South African universities to practitioners and academics and activists from the UK? And this is a big part of the work that I do. We really look deeply into what decolonizing means. Like, decolonizing does not mean reading 2 or 3 Black and brown authors and says that, hey, we've decolonized, but actually trying to disrupt the colonial flows of knowledge and actively looking at the Global South for discussions around solidarity and solutions. But many of these policies and processes in the global south, in places like South Africa and India, have come at the back of anti-colonial movements, anti-apartheid movements, ground-up feminist movements, and other social movements. So there's a lot to learn from these conversations. But we also know that this work is really hard. So we don't need to replicate labor, and in the long term, we can also save money and time by actually learning from the conversations that have already happened in the global south. So following this, I'm also going to talk a little bit about being a part of a student-led activist group in the UK, and how we formed demands around survivor-centered inclusive policies and practices, and around ground-up policymaking. So coming back to these South African offices. So the quotes that you see on the screen at the moment, I'm not going to read them out, all of them, but are from key people who helped set up these offices in South African universities. And they describe this idea as a one-stop shop where everybody, whether it is staff or students, could go to the same office. And this is really important because it comes up again and again, not only in South Africa, but also in my case, to work in India and other fieldwork locations. The importance of having this one office or one policy that covers all different communities within the university, so that complaints don't slip through the multiple bureaucratic policies and procedures. So this office was also set up away from the machinery of the university, and the members of the office reported directly to the Vice Chancellor. So there are many problems with that, which I'm not going to go deeply into. The offices usually consisted of a person who led the office, therapists, lawyers, education officers, student volunteers. So in one of these offices, they said they had 2 social workers, 2 legal officers, an education officer, and counseling support. But in spite of that, people in this office felt that they were under-resourced and constantly firefighting. And I wanted to mention this because it kind of shows the amount of labor that goes into kind of doing this work holistically. In the first instant, students and staff facing any form of sexual violence or gender-based violence were asked to come and speak to the office. And here they could just come for support, and they did not have to come only to file a formal complaint. Student volunteers were also trained to be the first point of contact, and this could be student on student or student and staff cases. And they could bring people with lived experiences to the office, after which professionals would take over. And even the volunteers could get mental health support where they're required, because this work was so emotionally taxing. All members of the office received training. This include people in the disciplinary panels. Describing the process, one person said that they asked, the first 2 questions that they asked when somebody approached the office were, what happened and what would you like to see happen after this? So if people with lived experiences wanted to go through a complaints route, investigators would essentially interview them, discuss and talk to witnesses, and sometimes even talk to people who have the people who've caused harm, and do a report on whether this should go ahead. If the decision was then made at that stage, along with the person with the lived experiences, that they would go ahead, a disciplinary panel was constituted. At the same time, all procedural safeguards, timeframes, policies, rights were carefully explained to the person who had caused harm as well. At one university, a person described safeguarding measures which were put in place during an investigation into a staff-on-staff sexual harassment complaint. So the safeguarding measures were particular to this one institution, but I think it's a really good example of good practice. So the investigator came to the offices in the department, and they sent out an email to every single person saying that they would be here within a particular time, and anybody could approach them if they wanted to talk. They could talk completely anonymously. They were offered complete safety, and they also assured people that there would be no retaliation. While these measures were put in, to protect the complainant and the witness, parallel measures were put in place to limit the person who has caused the harm, their access to the department. So they were suspended first for 2 weeks. But after the 2 weeks, when the head of the office came to know that they had broken their confidentiality and were talking about the case, the suspension was extended. So this is very interesting because through this process, they were actually able to find a pattern of abuse within the department, which actually then led to a group complaint. This then takes me to anonymous third party and group complaints. And this actually happened in quite a few cases, that it was actually through the investigations of the office that a complaint collective was set up. And they encouraged group complaints because, as both Anna and Anitha pointed out, that it's a pattern of behavior. It's often repeated behavior. It often have multiple people with lived experiences. So, but also it is often people came with individual cases through these offices, but through their experience, they formed a complaint collective and realized that they were not alone. These offices also encouraged anonymous complaint. So if they received an anonymous tip, they encouraged people to come forward with anonymous testimonies, and they could maintain complete anonymity. But from the code that you see on the screen, you can see that they encountered some challenges to it. The main one was that they wasn't sure how far they could take a case. So, for example, in one of the cases, a student wrote to them from an anonymous Gmail account about a fairly senior professor with complaints of grooming and harassment of students. And the office assured them that they should come forward and they would be offered anonymity, but the person did not reach out again. So at that point, what they decided to do was, first of all, to log a complaint. And they would always do that because they did receive anonymous tip. They would log a complaint so that they could establish a pattern of repeated behavior. And in cases, they would also start their own investigations like Anna was talking about. They also encouraged third-party complaints. But again, sometimes the challenge was when the perpetrator was outside of the university because they did not have any jurisdiction over them. Another example that was shared was that a student received a dick pic from a professor from another university at a conference, but the professor was from a different university. So what the office then did was they reached out to the university with the case and actually pushed that university and pressured them into taking action. And finally, they also mentioned that contracted staff were part of this policy. So it was sometimes tricky because the university was not directly employing them. But in this case, as they said, contracted workers would have to sign a code of conduct so that they could be held accountable before they started working for the university. Some universities also had policies to address, to prohibit staff sexual relationships. Student and staff sexual relationships. So they said initially they started with, they would have to declare a conflict of interest, but then they realized that this was an abuse of power and they decided to completely prohibit it. Now coming to the investigation processes. So in case where a disciplinary panel was set up, they said that the most important thing about the disciplinary panel that was that they changed it from an adversarial to an inquisitorial system. So they changed the key flashpoint for survivors. There was no direct cross-examination, no sitting in the same room with the person who has caused them harm. And only the committee could ask questions. But as you will see from the second quote on the screen, that the process could often become quite adversarial, particularly when the proceedings involved a senior member of staff and students. And this was a challenge that the office was constantly dealing with. The disciplinary panels of a staff and student and a staff and staff panel looked the same. It was always a 3-person panel, which had a chair, a gender expert, and then or a student or a staff representative, depending on who the complainant was. But at the end of the day, these proceedings could be quite traumatic and extremely difficult and demanding. So key approach that a person who actually led one of these offices said was, that they used was, you've told us, we heard you, we believe you. And they said that the true nature of a complainant-centered process was that we always believe you. Another participant who led another one of these offices said that they categorically told the complainant that a disciplinary process does not change, we believe you, even if the outcome was not favorable. So they always reiterated, a sense of belief. Here it is also important to mention that there was a variety of sanctions offered, including non-punitive sanctions, such as mandatory attending of courses, gender sensitization, or awareness trainings. But most importantly, they said was, there were 3 successful pillars to addressing sexual and gender-based violence within the university holistically. And that was policy, practice, and advocacy and sensitization working together at the same time. The 3 were deeply interlinked and could not be separated. And only if the 3 worked together could we attain sustainable long-term changes. But there were also challenges and drawbacks to this. And one of them was funding. Very often these offices were pushed to rely on short-term program-based funding, which made it really, really difficult to do work to achieve longer-term outcomes. It also meant that employees who should focus on providing support to survivors were actually focusing continuously on getting small pots of funding. The other challenge was the over-reliance on feminist figures within these offices and relying on these proactive individuals in key roles to push for change. So on one hand, participants said that how important it was to have these feminist figures within these offices, and they had a completely different experience when they were there. But at the same time, this over-reliance on individual change makers meant that they were frequently experiencing significant burnt out, physical and mental exhaustion, high levels of stress. They were also working without the support of management and without necessary resources to do this work. And lastly, the functioning of these offices differed significantly based on the politics of their leadership. So participants involved in these complaints processes spoke again and again about the distress when the managers of these offices or the university management prioritized their interests, bureaucracy, and their concerns over the care and interests of those accessing the service. So I'm going to stop with this now and very quickly, I know I'm running out of time, very quickly talk about our campaign in the UK. Melissa, am I out of time? Do you want me to stop?
No, go ahead.
Perfect. I'll be 2 more minutes, I promise. And this aptly summarizes our experience of why we started our campaign. I personally knocked on over 10 doors in my university, and no one knew what the processes were because the processes didn't really exist. So we all came from the global south where we had existing policies and practices. They didn't work, but we had them. So we were really, really surprised and taken aback that there was absolutely no policy around this in our university. So then we started a campaign for one. And these were some of the steps that we took. The first step was collecting testimonies because the university said, we don't act because we don't have any cases. And when we started collecting anonymous testimonies, we realized it was quite the opposite because there were cases in double digits. After that, we arranged a town hall meeting, which got together the entire university community. We invited the entire university community to kind of talk about the university culture and what were these cases saying about the culture within the university. And then third, we set up a campaign for setting up of a working group for ground up policy making. In this working group, most importantly, we demanded for representations from all sections of the university community, including catering staff, cleaners, security staff, the people who are often from the most marginalized, communities, but also they are, when looking at sexual harassment policies, we never look at, these workers. It's the cleaning staff who are in the university at 4 a.m. Also, payment for all non-wage workers and people on precarious contracts to attend meetings. complete transparency, we published full meetings of each meeting on our Facebook page, working with feminist experts to actually draft the policy. And we demanded that the community must be consulted before finalizing the policy. And these were also some of our demands, and of which I want to highlight one particular one is of having one policy for all students, staff and workers. And this is something we drew from our experiences of being activists in the Global South. Some of the other ones are on the screen. I'm not going to go into details because I'm running out of time. Finally, at the same time this was going on, we started a 4-part policy reading workshop. We read our university policy, we read good practices and policies from the UK, OFS and UK guidelines, and good practices and policies from global universities. Why we did that was that, A, to get the community involved. Our university communities know best what changes they want. We do not need big corporate organizations to come in and tell us what we need to do. We need to speak to our university communities. We need to people who work within this sector to understand what changes we want in the long term. To get buy-in from the community, but also at the same time provide the tools and information to the community so we can ask for accountability when that is needed. I'm going to end here, but you can read all about our South Africa report, which is getting launched on the 2nd of December, along with another report around silencing sexual misconduct in higher education and politics of naming that we worked with the 1752 group. I'm going to share the details of the event in the comments. So yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much. Let me. All right, thank you. And if you have any questions for Adrija or the prior two presenters, put them in the Q&A and we will get to them after my relatively brief presentation. And I don't know why I put myself last after all these wonderful women, but hopefully lots of your questions have been answered. But what I'm going to follow up on then is, just a really brief bio on myself. Melissa Hamilton, a professor of law and criminal justice at the University of Surrey. I've been working in the area of sexual misconduct in universities and criminal justice now for 30 or so years. And yes, I admit I'm using a photo of myself that is quite old. But I don't like my picture taken, so I'm just going with it. What I'm going to follow up with is condition E6 from the Office for Students. So even though it is addressed toward students, there is an aspect of it, some significant aspects related to staff. But first thing I want to ask you, you can use your hand raising, is how many of you have some familiarity with condition E6 just as a general rule? So you can put your little hand raising to indicate that you have some awareness of the condition at all from the Office for Students. Okay, so I'm only going to go into a few aspects of it here, and then we'll go to questions and answers. So there's this condition of registration is relatively new. It goes into effect, as you can see there, next year, which is going to come much quicker than I think anybody really can anticipate, will feel. It's regarding higher education providers in terms of how they're addressing sexual harassment and misconduct. And while the focus is on students, there are several aspects in particular that I did want to highlight that is relevant to misconduct specifically by staff against students. The intent here is not to get too much into detail because we just don't have enough time, as well as recognizing that there's going to be really difficult decisions that will be required from individual institutions about how to comply and about potential, unfortunately, repercussions of those decisions. Because I think there's going to be a lot of trade-offs that universities will have to make in terms of potentially infringing upon different rights of various parties and various groups. But the importance that I wanted to bring up here is that this condition is a strong step indicating that a regulatory body has raised the stakes significantly in terms of increasing awareness of the issues discussed today in this webinar, and believe probably why a lot of you are here, as well as significantly raise the stakes in terms of enforcing obligations of higher education institutions in managing sexual harassment and misconduct generally within their institutions. Now, to be clear here, this particular condition only applies, from my understanding, to providers in England and Wales, but it does extend to the work of those providers regarding their students in other countries. And that's particularly relevant to Adrija's talk about how our institution's going to navigate then applying a policy that may be originally based on both laws and norms within England and Wales to other countries where their norms and laws may be different. But the Office for Student has said that the providers do have an obligation to enforce some of the conditions to students who are in, and as well as staff in these other countries. Again, only going to mention a few things and we'll go to question and answer. So as you can see here, as a general rule, that condition E, one of it is that institutions must have a policy about intimate personal relationships between relevant staff members and students. And by the way, students will include graduate students. So you might be wondering what does some of the terminology mean? So as you can see here then is the Office for Student in the condition has given us some definitions. Relevant staff includes those with either direct academic or professional responsibility towards students. It includes at least those with teaching responsibilities, dissertation supervisors, personal tutors, pastoral support staff, some senior staff, those who are managing student complaints, mental health professionals working with students, and security personnel. The condition gives us examples of personnel that they think are likely not included, and the only types they provide are cleaning or catering staff. Although importantly, staff does include contractors. Now, in terms of intimate, what qualifies as an intimate personal relationship, it includes those that involve physical intimacy, whether isolated, for example, one-off events, or repeated sexual activity between them, or entailing romantic or emotional intimacy, seemingly in the latter without sexual interaction required. The document does note, though, that there will be some tension between differentiating emotional intimacy and required pastoral care, for example, in providing empathy for a struggling student. And that's then going to be some dividing lines that are going to be difficult for institutions to figure out, but it's going to be required within this condition. Another provision I wanted to highlight then is you can see it provides that providers are required to implement steps that could make a significant and credible difference in protecting students from any actual or potential conflicts of interest and or abuse of power. And this is in relation here to the intimate relationships between staff and students. There is, to comply, a provider could entirely ban these relationships, or they could have a general ban and then make some carve-outs for special classes. For example, the condition mentions there could be an exception for pre-existing relationships, meaning pre-existing, for example, the implementation of the condition, or the pre-existing relationships before the relevant staff student intervention had taken place. The Office for Students did actually, they flirted with mandating a strict ban, but they decided against it. They have then left it up to individual institutions to decide. But to me, there seems still to be kind of a thumb on the scale towards some type of ban, because merely disapproving or discouraging intimate personal relationships between staff and students is not itself sufficient, as you can see in subsection B. The document does set forth a non-exhaustive list of steps that higher education providers can take to help protect students. A non-exhaustive list means that they do go through some things they think might be helpful, but they don't say this is the entirety of it. So it's going to be up to individual institutions to determine how to address the problem at their particular university. But some examples here that I wanted to go through just briefly is providing information and training to both students and staff about appropriate professional boundaries in terms of their relationships, as well as training about what could constitute potential conflicts or abuses of power. Another example is institutions could create and maintain robust reporting systems, although I would assume that that probably is mandatory, although the condition doesn't say it is. But in any event, if an institution does not provide an outright ban on such relationships, one suggestion that the condition has is to require that intimate relationships be formally disclosed to the institution and kept on record. Although I can imagine there's going to be then some thought some thought into what are the repercussions of that? What do you do with that record, for example? What are the privacy implications of that? In any event, going back to the document itself, an option is to maintain a strong reporting and disciplinary system for potential misconduct. And the document does note that the dismissal of a staff member may be an appropriate measure for at least a serious violation of the institution's policy. Another step regarding managing potential conflicts of any such relationships to protect students. This might include, for example, to the extent that there is a relationship that is disclosed, the institution might then want to modify the staff member's duties with respect to that student so that they no longer qualify as a relevant staff member regarding that student. Another example could be removing the staff member's influence on various decisions regarding that particular student with which they have a relationship. Another example is take steps so that it doesn't appear that from that relationship, the student will gain some advantage relative to other students. So they are looking there at the extent that not only of the potential disadvantages to the student, but are other students going to think that that student has gained some advantages that might be problematic as well. Then also mentioned is the provider getting some sense of the prevalence of these relationships within their institution, as well as whether these kind of relationships, to the extent that they exist, do they tend to become problematic, and if so, how? That kind of studying the problem could be, for example, through surveys. And then the final one example I want to mention here is the institutions might want to monitor regularly how well the policy that they do implement is actually protecting students, such as it could be having discussions with their students in determining their views, their interests, and their needs with respect to such relationships. So I know that was relatively brief, and it was intended to be so, but I wanted to just introduce some things that your institutions are probably going to have to wrestle with in terms of complying with the Office for Student indication about having to address expressly intimate relationships between staff and students. And then just one other thing to mention, and we'll throw it to question and answer, is at least with respect to staff and student intimate partner relationships, to the extent that the institution deals with that, is it actually will have a ban on non-disclosure agreements. Now, again, emphasizing this is a ban on non-disclosure agreements with staff versus student. So it wouldn't affect, or it wouldn't be a requirement or a ban on non-disclosures between staff, although I know that is a topic that the people here today will be interested in. So I'll stop sharing now. And so let us go to questions and answers for everyone. One thing before we go to questions and answers, I do want to mention that today was basically about bringing up some of these topics, these important topics, from a broad perspective. This was not necessarily intent to be a discussion of specific policies, but at least Anna and I are anticipating offering another webinar in the future to go into more detail about policies and about good practices. And in anticipation of that, if you would like to put in what questions you would like to have in an additional webinar that gets into the details, put that in question and answer as well, and we'll pick those up and then try to include them in a future webinar to the extent that there is some interest. So now I'll hand it over to my fellow panel members to bring up some questions that you have seen in the question and answer that you want to address.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. And thanks so much, everyone, for all of your questions in the chat. Some of us have provided lengthy answers, but if there's ones that you'd like us to expand on verbally, please just either reply or repost the question and we can say some more. And there's one that's just come up from Elizabeth Day from the University of Bath, who said, in terms of a ban on staff-student relationships, one area that they're getting stuck on is the Students' Union officers and Students' Union staff. Any advice on this and how it could be considered within a ban? This is a really, really important point to talk about because it's interesting. This policy is owned by HR because it's a staff policy. It's about staff behaviour, and yet it has to be consulted on or has to have input from students. And HR usually are used to dealing with staff. They're used to consulting with staff. You might not be so used to consulting with students, and the Students' Union might not be. I would recommend going more widely than the Students' Union. So what my research has found, and what the Office for Students research has found, is that the vast majority of students are uncomfortable with staff having sexual or romantic relationships with students. I've also actually brought this up in my teaching, and I've got students to do a anonymous poll in class and to discuss it. And it always makes for a really, really interesting discussion. There's often some people who don't want their personal life, students, who don't want their personal life to be interfered with by the university. I do think that setting up a kind of set of discussions and making sure that you consult and open up these discussions really widely with PGRs, so postgraduate researchers, really, really need to be in this conversation. So if you've got a kind of a graduate school or some kind of representative body for graduate students, graduate research students, it's really important to engage them separately, distinctly from the Students' Union. So if possible, it would be really great to actually run the survey about whether students are comfortable or uncomfortable with these behaviours. The questions are available on our website, and I'll put the link in the chat. So you can just download our questions and use them if you've got the capacity to run student surveys. Even if you or otherwise do some focus groups and share these results. I think it's a question of communicating, finding out what students in your university think, because your student body might be, have different characteristics, and making sure you're kind of getting different groups of students, and then communicating what you found in whatever consultation you do really clearly. For example, we found with the National Union of Students study that racially minoritized students had slightly different kind of perspectives. And they actually wanted stronger professional boundaries, not just in personal relationships, but around alcohol, socializing, professional relationships more widely, which was quite a helpful finding. So yeah, I guess the short answer is a kind of a extensive consultation, or at least consultation beyond the Students' Union as well as with the Students' Union.
Anitha, you had a follow-up?
Yeah. So I think in terms of this, considering this ban, the focus is often on the relationship itself and the power imbalance in that relationship, and then the risks it creates for the students. I think we also need to be thinking about broader cultures that are created when these relationships are commonplace. So the broader cultures within the institution, when these relationships occur and are commonplace or not seen as a problem, is of usually male staff making advances on students. So there's a broader culture of exercise of power that it stays silent on or fosters when there isn't a clear stance taken on this. So it's beyond those particular relationships, which is a huge issue. Beyond that, it's a bigger issue that affects all students. When those cultures are just, we're silent on that and we enable those cultures, it creates conducive contexts for a whole range of everyday harms as well as harms that take place within that relationship itself.
So I want, Adrija, I want to know if you could talk a little bit more about sensitization, what you mean by that.
Actually, I should have explained the term. I did not realize that it was a term which is mainly I've encountered it in my work in India and South Africa, but it's a term which is not really used here. It basically means consciousness raising and training. So yeah, and it's something that like comes across again and again in my data of like the need for sensitization, and that needs to work together with policies and practices. So if you are kind of, and this happens both in South Africa and in India, where the same office who receives and deals with complaints also does these activities throughout the year, which involves overall changing of behavior and cultural change. And this is something which is advocated by the students, my student participants and my staff participants as well. The need for holistic year-round training, and not, sensitization training as a one-off consent training, and then we forget about it and do it as a tick box method, to do it as a more holistic, long-term approach. Does that answer the question, Melissa?
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I had trouble finding my audio again. Anitha, I wondered, did you have a follow-up?
No, I was looking at the question on one policy, and I was thinking of responding, but you wanted to raise something else, Melissa?
No, go ahead and do that, and then I'll follow up.
So there's a question on having one policy for both students and staff. So Helen has written about it. And there are views that staff on staff complaints should be led by a separate policy. So there's several ways of approaching this. So a policy, there's never only one document. So there's usually there can be one policy document which defines the problem, the scope of the problem, and then often there's signposts to other processes, complaints processes, the composition of the panel that will hear it. So in that composition of the panel may be different for staff on staff complaints, because there'll be issues around union representation, all of that. So what you could have is a policy, overall policy that's common to staff and students, and then there could be processes that mirror it but are specific to the needs of students or staff. So it doesn't acknowledging for specificity doesn't mean that you can't have a common framework to address these issues.
Yeah, and I would just like to emphasize there about, in terms of the Office for Student Condition E6, is they actually don't mandate the institution have one policy for everyone and for all of their campuses. So an institution could, at least with respect to that condition, have different staff student policies for different campuses, or maybe they differentiate graduate students and non-graduate students, or for whatever reasons they could make those distinctions even between programs. Sorry, Adrija, did you have a comment?
No, I was just about to say, in my research, I've encountered this question quite a lot, and we've taken this up in our campaigning, like as I spoke about in my presentation. And just like Anitha was saying, the thing that we were advocating for is like a bigger overarching policy, because when you are going through, or when one is going through significant traumatic processes, you should have that one place where you can go to, and a first point of contact that everybody could reach out to, who would be trained, who would know the policy, who would know exactly what processes were there, and you wouldn't have to, in my case, as I had to do, knock on 10 doors, and I was doing it as an ally, and I was still traumatized by the end of the process after having to say the same story over and over again. So that is something which comes up really loudly in my data. But again, like Anitha was saying, the disciplinary body committee that was set up was different for depending on who the complainant was. So there was always a chair, and there was always a gender expert on that committee. But the third member, if the complainant was a member of staff, it was a staff representative, but if the complainant was a student, it was a student representative. So that's what was different, and then obviously the sanctions were different depending if it was staff and student. But it was that one overarching policy, one office, one point of contact, one support services. So if one faces everything, they would know that that's the place, where you would go, as they described it, as a one-stop shop.
So I'm going to divert and say to Anna, there's been a number of questions throughout about anonymous reports and generally, and then one specifically about what if you have a student who wants to be anonymous, but they're afraid because the institution may be really small that by definition they will be identified just because people know each other. I know you've answered some in the Q&A, but additional comments you might have?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. I think this area is still very much a work in progress, and I appreciate there's also a question about guidance on how to accept anonymous reports from students who don't want to go down a formal route. I think we need to differentiate between anonymous and confidential reports. So anonymous is where the university don't know, there's no record of a student's name. So on report and support, they might have just made an anonymous disclosure. There's a really good blog post on Wonky from my colleague here at York, Nicola Campbell, who's our sexual violence and misconduct student manager. I'll put that in the chat in a minute. And she does talk about an example where they did take action on an anonymous report because there was enough evidence and information given in it. But usually anonymous reports are going to be for information gathering, for building up a picture of what's going on across the institution. Confidential reports, which is what I was referring to, where somebody discloses but doesn't want to go down a formal route. Therefore, the reporting party's identity and in fact their evidence might be used in a if it can be made if they can be made as pseudonymous, if they can be non-identifiable, there might be used in an investigation, but quite often reporting parties will want to stay confidential from the person they're reporting. Now, of course, in terms of weighing up evidence, giving the responding party the right to respond and to understand the allegations, there are significant challenges here, and I'm certainly not underestimating those. This is, I hate saying it's a case-by-case basis because it feels like a cop-out, but this is an example where the evidence that you're able to get depends on the specificities of the case. So I'm going to put a few links in response to the question in the chat. The new Pinson Mason's case studies guidance has got some examples of where they do actually proactively go to other students who have been allegedly victimized and ask them if they want to give evidence or make a formal complaint. So I was really glad to see that example in that guidance, which on the whole is on the more conservative end, but actually that's a more proactive way of going about it. But in terms of whether there's any clear guidance on how to implement this, I think our briefing note is quite short. I think there's more work to be done on thinking about how to do this in a trauma-informed way, which we haven't yet done, and I'm not aware of any kind of like user-friendly guidance. I'm actually doing a project with European colleagues at the moment, and the Belgians, it turns out the Belgians are doing this. So I'm going to write something short on good practice in a different national context quite soon. Which we'll share on the 7052 group blog, so keep an eye on that. Join our mailing list, but we're still, I think there's kind of still good practice being developed.
All right, so we only have a few minutes left. I want to give each of you an opportunity to give last comments, and so I'll start with the same order of presentations. Anitha, any last comments for the group?
So I do think that the OFS requirement presents an opportunity, and it would be great if that opportunity was seized, not just to meet the minimum requirements and to, pass the bar so your condition of registration is met. It'd be great if the resources that are being given to you in order to meet those requirements can be used to think more broadly, more imaginatively, think more widely to anticipate and address a wider range of issues, because otherwise, we'll be back here in a few. These issues won't go away. So now's the chance to do something bigger than what you have to do.
Great. Anna, last comments? At least for this webinar. I don't mean forever.
Yeah, I'm frantically putting links in the chat. But just to say, I think those of you who are doing work in the space, I know it's challenging. I think there's it's so important to be kind of pushing better practice all the time. I imagine you're probably pretty exhausted with actually just dealing with what is getting thrown at you on a day-to-day basis if you're in that kind of role. but we're still building the structures. And so keep on building the structures. And so it's really great to see all these questions about kind of developing new approaches.
Okay, and Adrija, last comments from you, please, for at least for today.
I was actually about to respond to the thing that Anna was talking about right before you went on last comments. Just one quick thing that colleagues in South Africa spoke a lot about in terms of confidential complaints. And they said we kept reminding ourselves that this is an administrative process. It is not a criminal justice process. And we have the opportunity to be creative. So I just wanted to put it up there. And last comments is basically what I started with, to say that a lot of the conversations that we are having today, colleagues and comrades have had it in the Global South. So we always don't need to try and reinvent the wheel. The answer is often out there, and it's for us to look a little wider and have these transnational conversations, but in a way that it's not extractive, and which shows solidarity to comrades there who are doing the work as well. And also, this work is really exhausting, like Anna was talking about, and you're not alone. And we are all there. We are feeling really exhausted very often. So please reach out, even if it is sometimes not to exchange knowledge, but sometimes just to have coffee and rant. There are people around. So yeah, please don't think that you're alone in this work.
Yes, I want to add on to that and thank you everyone as well for being interested in this work and doing the difficult job that it is to deal with sexual misconduct in university, particularly when you have leadership that is not leading in this area, as was represented today. Thank you everyone here. So I'm going to close out the recording. Again, the recording will be made available. And I would just ask the presenters if we could wait for a little bit and we can chat at the end. So thank you all. Have a good afternoon.